The orc woman named Kessa Roughwater stood in the back corner of the packed farmhouse hall, watching her cousin Marielle wear silk bought with silver that should have been hers. And she kept her face smooth as river stone, because showing pain would give them satisfaction they did not deserve. The wedding was a grand affair by frontier standards. 36 guests crowded into the largest room of the Roughwater homestead, tables laden with roasted pork and honeyed bread and wine imported from 2 valleys over. Kessa's Aunt Bethany moved through the celebration like a queen surveying her kingdom, her smile tight with triumph, her fingers glittering with rings that had belonged to Kessa's mother. Every coin spent here, every length of lace and wheel of cheese and cask of wine, came from the dowry Kessa's parents had built for her over 20 years of careful saving before the fever took them both in a single terrible winter. She had been 16 then, barely old enough to understand what inheritance meant, and her aunt and uncle had swept in with documents and sympathy and promises. They would hold her dowry in trust, they said. They would keep it safe until she came of age, until she found a proper husband. She had believed them because she had no one else, because grief made her stupid, because she was an orc girl alone in a human district, and the law was a thing that bent around her like water around stone. Now she was 23 and her dowry was being spent on her cousin's wedding feast, openly and without shame, and there was nothing she could do about it. Kessa moved through the crowd with a tray of filled wine cups, her head down, her tusks catching the lamplight. She wore the plain gray dress her aunt had given her, rough homespun that marked her as servant rather than family, though her blood was as Roughwater as any of them. The guests took cups from her tray without meeting her eyes, without thanks, as though she were furniture. She was used to it. Orcs in the Greymarsh district were rare enough to draw stares, but common enough to be dismissed. Tools for hard labor or cautionary tales for children. Never quite people in the way that mattered. She passed the head table where Marielle sat beside her new husband, a merchant's son from the next valley with soft hands and a softer chin. Her cousin's dress was cream silk with seed pearls at the bodice, work that would have cost 3 months of a farmhand's wages. Marielle caught her eye and smiled, a small private smile that held no malice and no guilt, only the blank contentment of someone who had never questioned whether she deserved the good things that fell into her lap. Kessa looked away and moved toward the corner where the contract witnesses sat. There were 3 of them, required by frontier law for any marriage involving property transfer. 2 were locals, farmers who served as witnesses for every wedding and land deal in the district, men who knew better than to ask questions when the Roughwaters wanted something documented. The 3rd was a stranger, brought in from outside the valley because the marriage contract was substantial enough to require an independent eye. He sat slightly apart from the others, a tall, lean man with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that gave nothing away. His clothes were worn but well kept, the practical garb of someone who worked with his hands but had known better days. He had not touched the wine in front of him, had barely touched the food. Instead, he had spent most of the evening with the contract ledger open before him, running his finger down columns of numbers with the focused attention of a man doing sums in his head. Kessa approached to refill cups, and he looked up. His eyes were gray as winter sky, direct and measuring, and for a moment she froze, expecting the usual calculation, the flicker of disgust or curiosity that humans wore when they looked at orc features. Instead, he simply nodded, the smallest acknowledgement, and returned to the ledger. She set down her tray and began collecting empty plates, moving quietly, listening without appearing to listen. The local witnesses were arguing amiably about grain prices, but the stranger said nothing, just turned another page, made a small notation in the margin with a stub of pencil. His hands were scarred across the knuckles, marked with the kind of old burns that came from forge work or friction. He wore no rings, carried no obvious weapons, presented himself as exactly what the Roughwaters had hired him to be: a professional witness, someone to lend legitimacy to their paperwork. But something in the way he held himself, the controlled stillness of a man who had learned to watch and wait, made Kessa think of soldiers. Her father had been a soldier once, before he married her mother and took up farming, and he had moved the same way. All that violence wrapped up tight and put away but never quite forgotten. She gathered the last of the plates and turned to go, but not before she saw him pause on a particular page, saw his finger tap twice against a line of figures, saw something flicker across his face too quick to read. Then it was gone and he was closing the ledger, standing to make his formal witness statement, and Kessa carried her burden of dirty dishes back toward the kitchen. The night wore on. Toasts were made, songs were sung. The bride and groom were escorted to their prepared chamber with much laughter and ribald advice. Kessa scrubbed pots in the kitchen, her hands red from hot water, while her aunt's voice drifted in from the hall, warm with wine and satisfaction. When the last guests finally stumbled out into the autumn dark, Kessa was permitted to retreat to her own space, a narrow room off the barn that had once been used for storing tack. She lay on her thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, and did not let herself cry because crying changed nothing, because she had learned long ago that grief was a luxury she could not afford. Morning came cold and clear. Kessa was up before dawn to milk the cows and collect eggs and haul water, the usual round of chores that filled her days. Her Uncle Thomas found her in the barn an hour after sunrise, his face still puffy from last night's wine. "The witness wants to see the property records," he said without preamble. "The stranger says he needs to verify some details for his report." Kessa looked up from the stall she was mucking out. "What details? How should I know? Man's too thorough by half." Thomas scowled. "Your aunt wants you to bring him what he asks for. We put him up in the guest room, didn't want him carrying tales back to town about Roughwater hospitality. Or didn't want him leaving before the contract was fully filed," Kessa thought, but she kept that to herself. What records does he need? Property transfers going back 7 years. Livestock sales. The usual. Thomas waved a hand vaguely. "It's all in the study, you know where everything is." She did. She had reorganized those records herself last winter, earning a copper piece and permission to sleep indoors during the worst of the cold. The irony of being ordered to help document her own dispossession was not lost on her, but she nodded and set aside her pitchfork. The stranger was waiting in the study when she arrived, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. He turned when she entered, and in the morning light she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of weathered face that came from years outdoors, and a scar that ran from his left temple into his hairline. His gray eyes were calm and unreadable. "You are Kessa Roughwater," he said. It was not a question. "I am. My name is Xander Dalton. I was hired to witness the marriage contract." He paused. "I have some questions about the property inventory." Kessa moved to the desk where the ledgers were kept, grateful for something to do with her hands. "My uncle said you need records going back 7 years. 8 would be better." He crossed to stand beside her, not crowding but close enough that she could smell wood smoke and soap. "I want to see everything relating to livestock acquisition, land transfers, and any dowry settlements." Her hands stilled on the ledger. Dowry settlements. "The marriage contract lists a substantial dowry provided by the bride's family," Xander said evenly. 300 silver marks, a breeding pair of cattle, household goods, and a small parcel of land. I need to verify that those assets existed to be transferred." "They existed," Kessa said, her voice flat. "I am sure they did, but I need to see the documentation." He pulled out the chair and sat, opening his own notebook. "Start with the land transfer, please. The deed to the eastern 40 acres that now goes to the new couple." Kessa found the deed, her fingers numb. The eastern 40 had been her father's pride, good bottomland with a creek running through it, rich soil that grew anything you put in it. He had bought it with his soldier's pension, and 10 years of saved wages had meant it to be the foundation of her future farm. She set the deed in front of Xander, and he studied it in silence, comparing it to his notes. "This deed was transferred to Thomas and Bethany Roughwater 8 years ago," he said finally. "From Simon and Martha Roughwater, your parents. They died that year. I know. I am sorry." He said it simply, without the performative sympathy that made condolences feel like insults. "Was there a will? I was told the property passed to my aunt and uncle as my guardians." "Was there a will?" he asked again, patient. "I do not know. I was 16 and sick with grief, and they handled everything." Xander made a note. "Do you remember signing any papers?" "No." The word came out harder than she intended. "Should I have? Possibly. Frontier law requires consent of all heirs over the age of 15 for property transfer, unless a will specifies otherwise." He looked up at her, his gray eyes very steady. "Even Orc heirs." Something in her chest pulled tight. "They said it was for my own good, that they would hold everything in trust. I am sure they did say that." He returned to the deed, running his finger along the margin where the transfer had been notarized. "But trust arrangements require specific legal language, and I do not see it here. This appears to be a standard property transfer with no conditions attached." Kessa sank into the other chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "Are you saying it was illegal?" "I am saying I have questions." Xander pulled another ledger toward him. "Let us look at the livestock records next." They worked through the morning, Xander asking quiet, precise questions while Kessa fetched documents and tried to keep her hands from shaking. The pattern emerged slowly, damning in its consistency. The cattle that should have been hers, sold 3 years ago, and the profit never mentioned. The household goods, her mother's carefully assembled collection of linens and cookware and furniture, dispersed to various Roughwater cousins or sold at market. The silver, deposited in her aunt and uncle's name and withdrawn steadily over the years for improvements to the main house, for Marielle's education, for 100 expenses that had nothing to do with Kessa's welfare. "They spent all of it," she said finally, her voice hollow. "Everything my parents left. Not quite all." Xander tapped the ledger. "There are still assets that can be traced. The land most obviously, since it has not been sold, only transferred in yesterday's marriage settlement. Some of the livestock can be accounted for through breeding records. The silver is more complicated, but there are debts owed to this household that could be claimed." He closed the ledger and looked at her directly. "If someone were willing to pursue the matter, pursue it how?" "By filing a complaint with the district magistrate. Presenting evidence of improper guardianship and misappropriation of inherited assets." He said it calmly, as though he were discussing crop rotation. "It would not be a simple process. Your aunt and uncle have standing in this district, and you are an orc making accusations against humans. But the law is the law, and the evidence is clear enough that a magistrate would have to hear the case." Kessa stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it is the truth, and you deserve to know it." "That is not an answer." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, her uncle was walking toward the barn, his step confident, his world untroubled. You were hired by the Roughwaters. You owe them your loyalty. I was hired to witness a contract, which I have done. I owe them accuracy, not loyalty. Xander's voice remained level. And I have certain professional standards about fraud. Professional standards, she laughed, a bitter sound. You are a witness for hire. What do you care if one orc girl gets robbed by her own family? I care because I spent 10 years as a debt collector, and I learned to recognize theft in ledgers, he said. And for the first time there was an edge to his voice, something that cut through her anger. I care because I am tired of watching people with power take from people without it, and call it legal. And I care because you stood in that hall last night and watched them spend your future on someone else's wedding, and you did not make a scene or beg or weep, and that kind of dignity should not go unanswered. The words hit her like a physical blow, unexpected and precise. She turned from the window, searching his face for mockery or pity, finding neither. I have no money to pay a magistrate's fees, she said finally. No way to even reach the district seat without permission to leave. My aunt and uncle control everything I have. Not quite everything. Xander stood, gathering the ledgers into a neat stack. You have these records, which I have now documented in my witness report. You have my testimony, which as a licensed contract witness carries legal weight. And you have time if you are patient. He paused. I have a farm 3 days north of here, near the Millbrook crossing. I need help with the autumn work and I can pay fair wages. If you wanted to leave this place, I could offer you employment. Kessa's heart was suddenly loud in her ears. You are offering me work. I am offering you a choice, Xander said quietly. You can stay here and continue as you are, or you can come north and earn your own money and decide what you want to do with these records. Either way, I will file my witness report truthfully, and your aunt and uncle will know that someone outside their circle has seen their bookkeeping. They will never let me leave. They have no legal right to keep you. You are 23 years old and not an indentured servant. He met her eyes. If you walk out that door, there is nothing they can do to stop you except make threats, and threats only work if you believe them. You make it sound simple. It is not simple. It is just possible, which is not the same thing. Xander picked up his notebook and slid it into his coat. I am leaving this afternoon. If you want to come with me, meet me at the crossroads an hour before sunset. If not, I will file my report anyway, and perhaps it will make some small difference down the line. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. For what it is worth, your parents built something real for you. It was stolen, but theft can sometimes be undone if the stolen thing is important enough to fight for. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hall, and Kessa was left standing in the study surrounded by ledgers full of her own dispossession, her pulse racing with something that felt dangerously like hope. The rest of the day passed in a fog of decision and doubt. Kessa went through her chores mechanically, hauling water and feeding chickens and scrubbing the kitchen floor, while her mind spun through possibilities. She owned almost nothing, had saved almost nothing, had no friends in the district who would shelter her if she ran. Everything Xander had said was true, but truth and safety were not the same thing. Her aunt found her in the kitchen just after noon, her expression sour. That witness was asking too many questions, Bethany said without preamble. Nosing through records like he was looking for crime instead of just signing papers. Your uncle is displeased. I just brought him what he asked for, Kessa said carefully. Did he say anything to you? Anything about the family's business? The lie came easily, smoothed by years of practice. No, madam, he barely spoke at all. Bethany studied her for a long moment, her eyes narrow with suspicion, then nodded. Good. The man has been paid and he will leave this afternoon, and that will be the end of it. We do not need outsiders making trouble." She turned to go, then looked back. "Marielle and her husband are moving to his family's house next week. You will take over her old room and help with the household management. It is time you made yourself more useful." Kessa kept her face blank and her voice grateful. "Thank you, madam." After her aunt left, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the farm that should have been partly hers, the fields her father had worked, the barn he had raised with his own hands. Everything here was built on theft, on the assumption that an orc girl would not fight back, would not even understand what had been taken from her. She thought about Xander Dalton's gray eyes, his calm certainty, his offer of choice. An hour before sunset, she wrapped her few possessions in a spare blanket and walked out the door. No one stopped her. The farmyard was empty, her aunt and uncle inside enjoying their evening meal, confident in their power and her compliance. She walked down the long drive with her head up and her heart hammering, half expecting a shout, a hand on her shoulder, some consequence for daring to leave. Nothing came. The crossroads lay at the edge of Roughwater land, where the farm track met the north-south road that connected the valley settlements. Xander was waiting with a sturdy draft horse hitched to a small wagon, his expression calm but his posture alert, a man ready to move quickly if needed. He looked up as she approached, and something in his face eased. "I was not certain you would come," he said. "I was not certain either." Kessa stopped a few paces away, suddenly awkward. "If I do this, if I go with you, they will call me ungrateful. They will say I am a thief running off with their property. Let them say it. Words are not the law." Xander held out a hand to help her into the wagon. "And you are taking nothing that does not belong to you." She took his hand, surprised by the warmth of it, the steadiness, and climbed up onto the wagon seat. Her bundle of possessions looked pitifully small in the wagon bed. Xander climbed up beside her and took the reins, clicking softly to the horse. The wagon lurched into motion, wheels creaking, and the Roughwater farm began to recede behind them. Kessa did not look back. They traveled through the evening and into dusk, the road winding north through forested hills. Xander drove in silence, his attention on the road, and Kessa was grateful for the quiet. She needed time to settle into what she had done, to believe that she had actually left. When full dark came, Xander pulled the wagon off the road into a small clearing and began setting up camp with the efficient movements of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He built a small fire, set a pot of stew to warm, laid out bedrolls on opposite sides of the clearing. "We will reach my farm tomorrow evening," he said as they ate. "It is not large, maybe 60 acres, half of it under cultivation. I raise mostly grain and vegetables, keep some chickens and a milk cow. The work is hard but steady." "What wage are you offering?" Kessa asked. "Room, board, and 2 silver marks a week," he glanced at her. "Plus a share of the harvest if you stay through to winter." It was more than fair, almost generous. "Why?" "Because I need the help and you need the wages. It does not have to be more complicated than that." But it was more complicated, and they both knew it. A human man and an orc woman traveling together, living on the same farm, would draw talk and suspicion. Frontier districts were insular, and anything that looked like impropriety could become a weapon in the wrong hands. "What will your neighbors think?" she asked. "That I hired a farmhand for the harvest." Xander's voice was firm. "Anyone who wants to make it into something else can keep their thoughts to themselves. I am not in the habit of explaining my decisions to gossips." Kessa studied him across the fire, trying to understand what drove him. He was not young, not old, not handsome in any conventional sense, just a weathered man with careful hands and a direct gaze. He had offered her escape without asking for anything in return, had spoken of law and fairness as though they applied to her the same as anyone. "Why did you really help me?" she asked quietly. "The truth this time." Xander was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the fire. When he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "I told you I was a debt collector for 10 years. What I did not tell you is what kind of debts I collected." He paused. "I worked for a merchant house that specialized in loans to people who could not get credit anywhere else. Farmers in bad years, widows trying to keep their land, young men who borrowed to buy into a trade. The interest was criminal and the terms were designed to trap people, and my job was to enforce the contracts." He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, his expression distant. "I was good at it. I knew the law well enough to find every loophole, and I was intimidating enough that most people paid rather than fight. I told myself I was just doing a job, that if I did not collect, someone crueler would, that the debts were legal even if they were not just." He looked up at her. "Then I foreclosed on a farm that belonged to an old couple who had borrowed to pay for medicine when their daughter got sick. The daughter died anyway, and I took their land, and they had nowhere to go." Kessa saw the old shame in his eyes, carefully controlled but still present. "I found them a week later in a shelter house, and the old man looked at me like I was death itself. He did not curse me or beg. He just asked if I slept well at night, knowing what I had done." Xander's mouth twisted. "I did not have an answer for him. So you quit?" "I quit, and I took the money I had saved from a decade of being the worst version of myself, and I bought a small farm far away from everyone I had hurt." He set down the stick. "I cannot undo what I did, but I can choose not to ignore theft when I see it happening in front of me. So when I saw those ledgers, when I realized what your family had done, I made a choice. To help me," Kessa said softly, "to do the right thing, which happened to involve helping you." He met her eyes. "I have spent enough of my life on the wrong side of fairness. I am done with that." They sat in silence while the fire burned low. Kessa thought about the weight of the past, the things people carried with them, the possibility of choosing differently. She had seen Xander as a stranger offering escape, but he was more complicated than that, a man trying to balance old debts with new choices. "Thank you," she said finally, "for the truth and for the choice." Xander nodded, his expression easing slightly. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day." She settled into her bedroll under the vast autumn sky, listening to the wind in the trees and the pop of the dying fire, and for the first time in 8 years, she fell asleep feeling like the future might hold more than servitude. Xander's farm was smaller than the Roughwater place but well tended, the fields neatly plowed and the fences in good repair. The house was a simple timber structure with a stone foundation and a good chimney, 2 rooms and a loft, built for function rather than comfort. A barn stood nearby, modest but solid, with space for animals and equipment. Everything about the place spoke of careful work, of a man who maintained what he owned and asked for nothing beyond what he needed. Kessa stood in the yard as Xander unhitched the wagon, taking in her new surroundings. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road, a thin plume of smoke marking their location. The land here was hillier than the valley she had left, the soil a darker loam, the air carrying a different quality of silence. "Chickens need feeding, and the cow needs milking," Xander said, nodding toward the barn. "I will show you where everything is, and then we can settle you in." The work was familiar, grounding. Kessa found comfort in the routine of animal care, the warm smell of hay and livestock, the simple tasks that required hands but not conversation. The cow was a placid old creature who leaned into Kessa's touch as she milked, and the chickens were fat and healthy, well kept. "You know your way around a barn," Xander observed, watching from the doorway. My father taught me when I was small. Before he died, we had a good-sized farm bigger than this. She paused, her hand steady on the milk pail. He believed in teaching me everything, said I needed to be able to run a place on my own if the need came. Wise man. He was. Kessa finished milking and stood, carrying the pail toward the door. He was also orc-born, which made things complicated. He had to be twice as careful, twice as honest, because people were always looking for reasons to mistrust him. Xander stepped aside to let her pass. Your mother was human. Yes. They met during the border wars when my father was serving in a mixed regiment. She was a camp follower, a laundress. Kessa set down the pail and began straining the milk. Her family disowned her when she married him, said she had degraded herself. His clan did the same, said he had betrayed his blood, so they made their own family, just the two of them, and then me. That must have been hard. It was all I knew. She glanced at him. They loved each other, though, loved me. That mattered more than what anyone else thought. Xander nodded slowly. Love is worth more than approval. They worked together through the evening, falling into an easy division of labor. Xander cooked a simple supper of beans and cornbread while Kessa set the table and hauled water. They ate in comfortable silence, and afterward Xander showed her to the loft where she would sleep, a clean space with a straw mattress and a woolen blanket. We start early, he said from the base of the ladder. First light if you can manage it. I can manage. He nodded and withdrew, and Kessa settled into her new bed with a strange sense of unreality. 2 days ago she had been a servant in her aunt's house, watching her future be stolen piece by piece. Now she was here, in a place where she was paid for her work, where the man who employed her spoke to her like a person rather than a burden. It felt fragile, like something that could shatter if she believed in it too hard. But she let herself believe, just a little, and slept better than she had in years. The days fell into a pattern. They rose before dawn and worked until dusk, bringing in the last of the grain harvest, repairing fence lines, cutting firewood for winter. The work was hard and Kessa threw herself into it, grateful for the way it left her too tired to think, too focused to worry. Xander was a quiet presence, not given to unnecessary talk, but he noticed things. Brought her water when she was flagging, adjusted the work when he saw her struggling, praised her effort without making it awkward. He was, she realized slowly, the most considerate man she had ever worked with. In the evenings they ate together and sometimes talked, small conversations about the farm or the weather or the neighbors. Xander mentioned the district magistrate's circuit would come through Millbrook in 6 weeks, and if Kessa wanted to file a complaint about her inheritance, that would be the time to do it. I have been thinking about it, she said one night, mending a tear in her work shirt while he carved pegs for a new gate, about what it would mean to actually fight them. It would mean a legal battle that could take months, Xander said evenly. It would mean facing your aunt and uncle in front of a magistrate and possibly a crowd. It would mean having every detail of your parents' death and your guardianship examined publicly. You are not making it sound appealing. I am making it sound true. He set down the half-carved peg. But it would also mean having a chance to reclaim what is yours. The land at minimum, your father's farm, that is worth something. If I win, the evidence is on your side. Frontier law is clear about inheritance rights, and your aunt and uncle did not even try to hide what they did. He paused. But yes, there is risk. A magistrate might decide in their favor because they have standing and you do not, or he might split the difference and give you a token settlement that satisfies no one. The law is better than nothing, but it is not perfect. Kessa set down her mending. What would you do if it were your decision? Xander considered the question seriously. I would fight. But I am a man and human, and the law bends more easily in my favor. Your calculation is different, and I cannot make it for you." "That is not helpful." "No," he agreed, "but it is honest." She appreciated the honesty, even when it left her more uncertain than before. The truth was she wanted her land back, wanted her parents' legacy restored, wanted to see her aunt and uncle held accountable for 8 years of theft. But wanting and achieving were oceans apart, and she had learned not to trust in fairness. Still, the thought took root and grew. 3 weeks into her employment, a neighbor came visiting. His name was Harold Granger, a stocky man in his 50s who owned the farm to the east. He arrived on horseback one morning and dismounted with the air of someone delivering important news. "Xander," he said, nodding brusquely. Then his eyes found Kessa, who was hauling firewood to the shed, and his expression shifted into something guarded. "Did not know you had hired help." "This is Kessa Roughwater," Xander said, his tone giving nothing away. "She is working the harvest with me. Kessa, this is Harold Granger, my neighbor." Harold's eyes lingered on her tusks, her green skin, the obvious fact of her Orc heritage. "Roughwater. Any relation to the family down in Greymarsh Valley?" "Distant," Kessa said carefully. "Huh." Harold turned back to Xander. "You know there is talk in town, people wondering why you need an Orc woman living on your farm." "People should mind their own business," Xander said mildly. "I am just saying it looks a certain way. You being alone out here, her being young and well." Harold gestured vaguely. "Could bring you trouble. Then it will be my trouble to deal with." Xander's voice was still mild, but there was steel underneath. "Was there something you needed, Harold? Or did you ride over just to share gossip?" Harold flushed. "I came to warn you as a neighbor. Some folks are not happy about Orcs settling in the district. There has been talk about the border raids last spring, about how we should be more careful who we let onto our land. Kessa is not raiding anyone. She is working an honest job for honest pay." Xander crossed his arms. "If people have concerns, they can bring them to me directly instead of spreading rumors. I am just passing along what I heard. And now you have passed it along. Thank you for your concern." It was clearly a dismissal. Harold looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Xander's expression stopped him. He mounted his horse with an air of affronted dignity and rode off, leaving a wake of unspoken threats behind him. Kessa set down the firewood, her hands shaking slightly. "He is going to make trouble." "Let him try." Xander turned toward the barn. "You have done nothing wrong, and neither have I. Employment is legal, and what people choose to imagine beyond that is their problem. You could lose standing in the district. People could stop trading with you. Then I will trade elsewhere." He stopped and looked back at her, his gray eyes steady. "I am not going to fire you because my neighbors are small-minded. You are a good worker and you have every right to be here. That is the end of it." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing in the yard with a tangle of gratitude and worry in her chest. She knew what it cost to stand against community opinion, how isolation could break even strong men. Xander was risking his reputation, his livelihood, possibly his safety, just to keep a promise of fair wages and a chance. That night she tried to thank him, but he waved it off. "I hired you to do a job," he said. "The rest is just noise." But it was not just noise, and they both knew it. The trouble came a week later, small and mean. Someone cut a section of Xander's fence during the night, letting his cow wander onto the road where she nearly caused an accident. Then a load of grain he had sold to the Millbrook mill was rejected for imaginary quality problems, costing him a week's income. Small acts of sabotage and shunning, the kind of pressure designed to make life difficult without crossing into outright violence. Xander endured it with the same calm he brought to everything, repairing the fence, finding a new buyer for the grain, refusing to acknowledge the pattern. But Kessa saw the tension in his shoulders, the weariness that came from fighting battles that never quite ended. "You should send me away," she said one evening, watching him mend the cut fence. "This will only get worse if I stay." "I am not sending you away." "Why not? I am causing you nothing but problems." Xander drove in a fence post with more force than necessary. "You are not causing anything. The people who are doing this are causing problems, and I will not reward them by giving in." He turned to face her, his expression fierce. "Besides, I told you when we started this that you had a choice. That choice does not disappear just because things get difficult. You stay or go based on what you want, not what the neighbors want. What I want does not matter if it destroys your life. My life is my own to risk," he said sharply. Then he softened, some of the anger draining away. "I have made worse choices for worse reasons, Kessa. Letting you work my farm is not one of them." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was something there beyond stubbornness, beyond principle, something that looked almost like care. The realization sent a flutter through her chest that she did not quite know what to do with. 2 days before the magistrate's circuit was due in Millbrook, Xander drove them into town for supplies. It was a small settlement, barely more than a crossroads with a general store, a mill, and a meeting hall that served as courthouse and church depending on the day. People stared as they walked down the main street, conversation stopping, eyes following Kessa with undisguised hostility. She kept her head down and stayed close to Xander, hating the fear that made her small but unable to shake it. They were loading supplies into the wagon when a group of men approached, led by Harold Granger. There were 5 of them, farmers and tradesmen, all carrying the self-righteous anger of men convinced they were defending something. "Xander Dalton," Harold said loudly, "we need to talk to you about your hired woman." Xander straightened slowly, setting down a sack of flour. "What about her?" "She is not welcome in this district. We have talked it over and we want her gone." "You have no authority to make that demand. We have the authority of concerned citizens." Harold stepped closer, his face red. "You brought an orc onto your land and people are worried. There are families here, children. We do not need her kind bringing trouble." "Kessa has brought no trouble," Xander said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The only trouble in this district is standing in front of me right now." One of the other men, a blacksmith named Curtis, spat on the ground near Kessa's feet. "Orc lover, you are as bad as she is." Xander moved so fast Kessa barely saw it, stepping between her and the men, his hand hovering near the knife at his belt. "Say that again." Curtis flinched but held his ground. "Everyone knows what you are doing out there. Living in sin with a greenskin, pretending it is honest work. You are a disgrace. I am a man minding my own business, which is more than I can say for you." Xander's voice was ice. "Now step back before you do something you regret." "Or what?" Harold demanded. "You will fight all of us. We are not afraid of you, Dalton." "Then you are fools." Xander did not raise his voice, but the air seemed to tighten around him, the old violence rising to the surface. "I have killed better men than you for worse reasons. Do not test me." The men hesitated, reading the truth in his eyes, the promise of consequence. Kessa saw them recalculate, saw the bluster drain away as they realized he meant every word. "This is not over," Harold said, but he was backing away. "We will see what the magistrate has to say when he comes." "I look forward to it," Xander said coldly. The men dispersed, muttering, and Xander stood rigid until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Kessa, his expression carefully controlled. "Are you all right?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good." He began loading the wagon again, his movements sharp with suppressed anger. Let us get out of this town before I do something inadvisable. They drove back to the farm in silence, the air thick with unspoken things. Kessa kept seeing the way Xander had moved, the coiled threat in his stillness, the absolute certainty that he would have fought 5 men to defend her. It was terrifying and humbling in equal measure. When they reached the farm, she finally found her voice. "You would have killed them," she said quietly, "if they had touched me." Xander unhitched the horse, not looking at her. "Yes." "Why?" "Because no one has the right to hurt you." He said it simply, as though it were obvious. Not them, not anyone. Kessa felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked tight for 8 years. "You barely know me." "I know enough." He finally met her eyes, and the intensity there made her breath catch. "I know you were robbed by people who should have protected you. I know you endured it with more grace than most could manage. I know you are brave enough to walk away and start over, and I know you work harder than anyone I have ever hired." He paused. "That is enough to make you worth defending. You could have let them run me off. It would have been easier." "I am tired of doing what is easier," Xander said, and there was something raw in his voice, something that had been buried for years. "I spent a decade taking the easy path, the profitable path, and it made me into someone I despised. I am not going back to that, not for Harold Granger or anyone else." He turned and walked toward the house, his shoulders tight, and Kessa stood in the yard feeling like the world had shifted beneath her feet. She had thought Xander was helping her out of principle, out of guilt for his past, out of some abstract notion of fairness. But the way he had stood between her and those men, the raw fury in his eyes, spoke of something more personal, something that made her pulse race and her thoughts scatter. That night, they ate dinner in charged silence, the air between them humming with all the things neither of them could say. Kessa caught Xander watching her when he thought she was not looking, and when their eyes met he did not look away, just held her gaze with an intensity that made her skin warm. "The magistrate comes in 2 days, he said finally. "If you want to file your complaint, I will go with you, stand as your witness, help you present the evidence. You have already done enough. It is not about enough." He set down his fork. "I want to see this through. See you get what you are owed. Why does it matter so much to you?" She needed to understand, needed to know what drove him. Xander was quiet for a long time, his eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "Because I think I am falling in love with you, and I need to know that you have the choice to stay or go based on what you want, not what you have lost." The words hung in the air like a bell's echo, clear and irrevocable. Kessa stared at him, her heart a wild thing in her chest. "You cannot mean that." "I do mean it." He looked at her steadily. "I did not plan it, did not expect it, but somewhere between the ledgers and the fence repair and watching you face down a town full of hatred without flinching, I fell. And I will help you reclaim your inheritance whether you feel the same or not, because you deserve it. But if there is any chance you might stay here, might build a life with me, I need it to be because you choose it, not because you have nowhere else to go." Kessa could not breathe, could not think past the roaring in her ears. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such raw honesty, such vulnerability. Men did not fall in love with orc women, not in the world she knew. They used them, tolerated them, sometimes desired them in secret, but they did not stand in firelight and confess love like it was a gift they were offering. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "You do not have to say anything." Xander's smile was crooked, self-deprecating. "I just needed you to know, so that when we go to the magistrate, when we fight for your land, you understand that I am not doing it to bind you to me. I am doing it to set you free." He stood and cleared the dishes, moving to give her space, and Kessa sat at the table with her thoughts in chaos. She thought about the way Xander had defended her, not just with words but with his whole body, his willingness to bleed. She thought about his steady hands and his quiet competence, the way he never made her feel small or less than, the way he listened when she spoke as though her words mattered. She thought about evenings by the fire and early mornings in the barn, the comfortable rhythm they had built, the easy partnership that had grown between them. And she thought about the flutter in her chest when he looked at her, the warmth that spread through her when he smiled, the way she had started to imagine a future that included him. She had been so focused on survival, on reclaiming what was stolen, that she had not let herself want anything beyond safety and fairness. But Xander was offering more than that. He was offering love, freely given, without conditions or expectations. It terrified her. It also felt like the most honest thing anyone had ever laid at her feet. She found him in the barn an hour later, checking on the animals before bed. He looked up when she entered, his expression carefully neutral, braced for rejection. "I do not know if I love you," she said, the words tumbling out. "I do not know if I even know what love is supposed to feel like. My parents had it, but they are gone, and I have spent so many years just trying to survive that I forgot to think about anything else." Xander nodded slowly. "I understand." "But," Kessa continued, stepping closer, "I know that I feel safe with you. I know that I trust you in a way I have not trusted anyone since my father died. I know that when you stood between me and those men today, I felt something that was not just gratitude. And I know that when I think about leaving this farm, about going somewhere else, the thought makes me ache." She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the hope kindling in his gray eyes. "So, I do not know if it is love," she said softly. "But it might be the beginning of love, and I would like to find out." Xander's breath escaped in a rush, relief and joy mingling on his face. "That is more than I hoped for." "You are a strange man, Xander Dalton," Kessa said, echoing words she had heard a dozen times applied to people like her, turning them into something fond. "Falling for an orc woman who brings you nothing but trouble. You bring me more than trouble." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, steady as stone. "You bring me a reason to be better than I was. That is worth everything." She squeezed his hand, marveling at how such a simple touch could feel so significant. "Let us reclaim my land first, then we can figure out what comes next." "Agreed." He smiled, and it transformed his whole face, made him look younger, lighter. "Together." "Together," she echoed, and the word felt like a promise. The magistrate arrived in Millbrook on a cold, clear morning, traveling with a clerk and 2 guards, all the apparatus of frontier law condensed into 4 road-weary men. The meeting hall had been arranged as a makeshift courtroom, with a table for the magistrate and benches for petitioners and witnesses. By the time Kessa and Xander arrived, the hall was already half full. Locals come to watch the proceedings or bring their own disputes. Kessa wore her best dress, the one good garment she owned, and carried a folder of documents that Xander had helped her prepare. Her hands were steady, but her stomach churned with nerves. She had never challenged authority, never stood in front of officials and demanded anything. The weight of what she was attempting pressed down on her. Xander touched her elbow gently. "You can do this." She nodded and walked into the hall, feeling every eye turn toward her. The magistrate was a thin, severe man named Edmund Gray, his face lined with years of hearing grievances and dispensing judgment. He listened to 3 minor land disputes and a complaint about stolen livestock before Kessa's name was called. She stood, her legs unsteady, and approached the table. "State your name and your business," Magistrate Gray said without looking up from his ledger. "Kessa Roughwater, Your Honor. I am here to file a complaint regarding the misappropriation of my inheritance by my guardians, Thomas and Bethany Roughwater of Graymarsh Valley." That got his attention. He looked up, taking in her green skin and tusks, his expression sharpening. "This is a serious accusation. What evidence do you bring?" Kessa laid out the documents. The property deed, the livestock records, the accounting of her parents' assets, and the subsequent dispersal. Xander stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring, and added his testimony as a licensed witness who had reviewed the Roughwater books. "The evidence shows a clear pattern of assets transferred from the estate of Simon and Martha Roughwater to Thomas and Bethany Roughwater, without the consent or knowledge of the legal heir," Xander said, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority. "No trust was established, no guardianship account maintained. The property was simply absorbed into the guardian's holdings and used for their own benefit." Magistrate Gray studied the documents with a frown. "These are serious charges. Where are the accused?" "They were not notified of this hearing, Your Honor," the clerk said. "The complaint was filed only 3 days ago." "Then they must be summoned." Gray looked at Kessa. "This matter cannot be decided without hearing the other side. I will issue a writ requiring Thomas and Bethany Roughwater to appear before me when I return to this circuit in 1 month. At that time, we will hear full testimony and render judgment. 1 month. Kessa felt her heart sink. Another month of waiting, of uncertainty, of giving her aunt and uncle time to prepare their defense. But Xander was nodding. "That is fair, Your Honor. We will be ready." The magistrate made a note in his ledger. "See that you are. And Miss Roughwater, be aware that false accusations carry penalties. If this is found to be a frivolous claim, there will be consequences." "I understand, Your Honor." Gray dismissed them and called the next petitioner. Kessa walked out of the hall on trembling legs, the folder of documents clutched to her chest. Outside, she turned to Xander. "A month. They will have a month to build a defense, to hide evidence, to make me look like a liar." "They will have a month," Xander agreed, "but so will we. And we have the truth on our side. The truth did not protect me before, because you were alone and powerless before." He met her eyes. "You are neither of those things now." The words steadied her, gave her something to hold on to. She nodded slowly. "What do we do next?" "We go home," Xander said. "We prepare, and when the time comes, we fight." The month that followed was tense and busy in equal measure. Xander helped Kessa refine her testimony, walking her through what the magistrate would likely ask, how to present her case clearly without letting emotion undermine her credibility. They gathered additional evidence, tracking down records from the district clerk's office, finding witnesses who remembered Simon and Martha Roughwater and could speak to the size of the estate they had left. Kessa threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction from her nerves. But in the quieter moments, she found herself thinking about Xander's confession, about the possibility he had laid before her. He did not press, did not ask for reassurance or declaration. He simply continued as he had, steady and kind, offering help without expectation of return. But sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. And sometimes when they worked side by side, their hands would brush and neither would pull away. 3 weeks into the wait, a letter arrived from Thomas Roughwater. It was brief and cold, accusing Kessa of ingratitude and deception, warning that if she pursued this complaint, she would be disowned and shunned by the entire family. It promised that the magistrate would see through her lies and she would be left with nothing. Kessa read it twice, then handed it to Xander without comment. He scanned it and his jaw tightened. "Empty threats. They feel real enough, because you are used to their power over you." He set the letter aside. But they have no legal authority to disown you because you were never legally adopted, and their threats of shunning mean nothing if you are not planning to return to them. What if I lose? The fear finally broke through her composure. What if the magistrate decides in their favor and I am left with nothing, not even a family? Xander crossed to her, taking her shoulders gently. Then you will still have this job, this place, and a man who loves you. That is not nothing. It is not my land, not what my parents built for me. No, he agreed, but it is a foundation to build from, and if the worst happens, we build something new together, something that is ours. The casual way he said ours, the easy assumption of partnership made something in her chest expand. I am afraid, she admitted. I know. He pulled her into an embrace, his arms solid around her. Fear is reasonable, but do not let it stop you from fighting for what is right. She leaned into him, letting herself take comfort in his strength, in the steady beat of his heart against her ear. It would have been so easy to stay like this, to hide from the coming confrontation, to settle for safety over justice. But her parents had fought for their place in the world, had built something real despite every obstacle. She owed it to them to fight for what they had left her. The day of the hearing arrived cold and bright, frost on the ground and the sky a hard blue. Kessa and Xander rode into Millbrook to find the meeting hall already crowded. Word of the complaint had spread, and half the district had turned out to watch an orc woman accuse a respectable human family of theft. Thomas and Bethany Roughwater sat in the front row with their lawyer, a slick-looking man from the county seat. They did not acknowledge Kessa's arrival, but she felt their eyes on her, heavy with anger and contempt. Magistrate Gray called the hearing to order and invited Kessa to present her case first. She stood and walked to the front, her prepared testimony in hand, and began to speak. She told the story simply and clearly. The death of her parents, the assumption of guardianship by her aunt and uncle, the promises made and broken. She presented the documents showing the assets her parents had left, and the way those assets had been absorbed into the Roughwater family holdings without legal authority. She spoke of 8 years spent as a servant in the house that should have been partly hers, watching her inheritance spent on others while she was given nothing. Her voice shook only once when she described watching Marielle's wedding, and she steadied it through sheer force of will. Xander testified next, his professional credentials lending weight to the evidence. He walked the magistrate through the ledgers, pointed out the irregularities, explained how frontier inheritance law had been violated. Then it was the Roughwaters' turn. Their lawyer stood and painted a very different picture. He described Thomas and Bethany as generous guardians who had taken in a difficult orc child out of charity, who had fed and housed and educated her for 8 years at their own expense. He claimed the assets from Simon and Martha's estate had been used entirely for Kessa's benefit, that she had been ungrateful and resentful, because she was not given the same privileges as the natural-born children of the family. It was a masterful performance, mixing truth and lies so smoothly that Kessa felt sick listening to it. Bethany testified with tears in her eyes, speaking of how hard she had tried to make Kessa feel welcome, how the girl had always been sullen and withdrawn, how it broke her heart to be accused of theft when she had given so much. Thomas spoke of the burden of raising an orc child in a human community, the expense and difficulty, the thankless nature of the task. By the time they finished, Kessa could feel the mood in the room shifting. People who had been sympathetic now looked uncertain, swayed by the respectable grief of the Roughwaters and the lawyer's smooth explanations. Magistrate Gray called for closing statements. The Roughwater lawyer stood and made an impassioned plea for the complaint to be dismissed, describing it as the vengeful fantasy of an ungrateful girl who had been given every advantage and squandered it. Then, it was Xander's turn. He stood slowly, his expression calm, and when he spoke his voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. "Your Honor, the defense has told a compelling story about generosity and ingratitude, but stories are not evidence and feelings are not law." He picked up the property deed. "This is evidence. A deed transferred from Simon Roughwater to Thomas Roughwater without the consent of the legal heir, in violation of frontier inheritance statutes. The defense has not disputed this fact, only tried to justify it." He set down the deed and picked up the ledger. "This is evidence. A detailed accounting of assets sold and money spent, none of it for the benefit of Kessa Roughwater. The defense claims these expenditures were made on her behalf, but the ledger shows otherwise. Kessa's expenses are listed separately, and they amount to less than 2% of the total assets dispersed. The rest went to improve the main house, to fund Marielle's education and wedding, to expand the Roughwater holdings. Not charity, appropriation." Xander's voice was steady, relentless, professional. "Frontier law exists to protect the vulnerable, to ensure that orphans are not robbed by those entrusted with their care. If this court allows the Roughwaters to keep what they have taken, it sends a message that the law does not apply equally, that power and respectability matter more than justice. I do not believe that is the message Your Honor wishes to send." He sat down, and the room was silent. Magistrate Gray frowned at his notes, at the documents spread before him, at the two families sitting on opposite sides of the hall. The moment stretched, tense and fragile. Finally, he spoke. "I have reviewed the evidence and heard the testimony. While I recognize that guardianship is a difficult responsibility, the law is clear about the management of a minor's assets. A guardian holds property in trust and must account for its use. The evidence shows that Thomas and Bethany Roughwater did not maintain a separate guardianship account, did not seek court approval for major asset transfers, and did not preserve the inherited property for the benefit of the heir." He looked at Thomas and Bethany, his expression stern. "Whatever your intentions, your actions violated your legal duty. The property and assets that belonged to Simon and Martha Roughwater should have been held for Kessa Roughwater, and they were not." Bethany made a sound of protest, but the magistrate raised a hand. "However, the question of remedy is complicated. Some assets have been sold and the money spent in ways that cannot easily be recovered. Other assets, particularly the land, remain intact and can be returned." He made a note in his ledger. "I hereby order the following. The eastern 40 acres currently deeded to Thomas Roughwater is to be transferred to Kessa Roughwater, as it was originally part of her father's estate. Additionally, Thomas and Bethany Roughwater are to pay restitution in the amount of 200 silver marks, representing the approximate value of the dispersed movable assets. Payment is to be made within 6 months. The room erupted in noise, gasps and mutters, and a cry of outrage from Bethany. Thomas stood, his face purple with rage, but the magistrate's guards moved to flank him and he subsided. Kessa sat frozen, unable to process what she had just heard. She had won. Not everything, but enough. Her father's land would be hers again. The money would give her a foundation to build on. Xander's hand found hers under the table, squeezed gently. "It is done." She turned to him, tears blurring her vision. "We won." "You won," he corrected. "You fought and you won." The magistrate was still speaking, finalizing details, but Kessa barely heard. She was too busy feeling the weight of 8 years lift from her shoulders, the future suddenly opening before her like a door swinging wide. When the hearing adjourned, Thomas and Bethany left without speaking to her. their lawyer muttering about appeals that everyone knew would go nowhere. The crowd dispersed slowly, some people congratulating Kessa awkwardly, others avoiding her gaze. She walked out into the cold afternoon air feeling light-headed, unmoored. "What do I do now?" she asked Xander. "Now we go to the land office and file the transfer, make it official." He smiled. "And then we go look at your farm." The Eastern 40 was everything her father had promised and more. Rich bottomland with a creek running through it, good soil that had been lying fallow under rough water management but would flourish with care. There were remnants of old fence lines, the foundation of a barn her father had started but never finished. Evidence of dreams interrupted. Kessa stood in the middle of the field and turned slowly, taking it all in. This was hers now, legally and irrevocably hers. Land she could build on, plant on, pass on to her own children if she chose. "It will take work," Xander said, walking the fence line. "The soil needs amending and you will need to rebuild the barn, but the bones are good. My father always said this was the best land in the valley." Kessa knelt and dug her fingers into the dark earth, feeling the richness of it. He wanted to build a house here, big enough for a family, wanted to plant an orchard on the south slope. "You could still do that." "I could." She looked up at him, this man who had given her back her future. "Or we could." Xander went very still. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I do not want to farm this land alone. I am saying that somewhere between the ledgers and the hearing and a month of working beside you, I stopped being afraid of what I feel." She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "I am saying that I think I love you, Xander Dalton, and if you still want me, I am yours." His face transformed, joy breaking through the careful control. "If I still want you, Kessa, I have wanted nothing else since the moment I saw you standing in that hall, holding your dignity like a weapon." He closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his scarred hands, his touch reverent. "Are you sure? Because once I have you, I will not let go. I will build you a house on this land and plant your father's orchard and spend every day trying to be worthy of you." "You are already worthy," she said, and kissed him. It was not her first kiss, but it was the first that mattered, the first that felt like a beginning rather than a mistake. Xander kissed her like she was precious, like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. His hands were gentle in her hair, his mouth warm against hers, and when they finally broke apart they were both breathless. "Marry me," he said, the words tumbling out. "I know it is too soon. I know you just got your land back and you should take time to decide what you want, but I have to ask." "Marry me, Kessa. Build a life with me," she laughed, giddy with happiness. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children, and when he set her down, he kissed her again, longer and deeper, a promise sealed. They were married a month later in the Millbrook meeting hall, with the magistrate officiating and a handful of neighbors bearing witness. It was a small ceremony, simple and genuine, with none of the false grandeur of Marielle's wedding. Kessa wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Xander had bought her, dark green to match her skin, and she carried wildflowers from the creek bank. Xander wore his best shirt and looked at her like she hung the moon. When it came time for the exchange of property, as was traditional in frontier weddings, Xander presented her with a small wooden box. Inside were 200 silver marks, counted out in neat stacks. Kessa stared at the money, then at him. "This is the restitution payment. It came early." "I bought it from your aunt and uncle," Xander said quietly. "Paid them 250 marks for the debt they owed you, because I did not want you to have to wait 6 months or deal with them dragging their feet. That is more than half of what you must have saved. It is an investment in our future." He took her hands, pressing the box into them. "Every coin of your dowry reclaimed and returned to you, Not as bride price to me, but as what is rightfully yours. Use it however you wish." Kessa felt tears sting her eyes. "You spent your savings to buy back my inheritance." "I spent my savings to give you a choice," he corrected. "If you want to use this to build on your land, we will build together. If you want to invest it somewhere else, we will do that. If you want to bury it under a tree for safekeeping, that is fine too. It is yours, Kessa. That matters." She kissed him in front of everyone, the silver coins pressing between them, and when they broke apart, the small crowd was cheering. The magistrate pronounced them married, and they walked out into the spring sunshine hand in hand. They spent the first month of marriage living on Xander's farm while they planned what to build on Kessa's land. It was a time of joy and discovery, learning the rhythms of partnership, the give and take of shared life. Xander taught Kessa the finer points of crop rotation, and she taught him her mother's recipes for preserving food. They argued amiably about where to place the new barn and made love under quilts while spring rain drummed on the roof. Some neighbors remained hostile, but others, seeing the magistrate's judgment and the obvious legitimacy of the marriage, slowly warmed. Harold Granger never apologized, but he stopped spreading rumors and eventually began nodding to them in town. It was not friendship, but it was a kind of peace. In late spring, they broke ground on the new house, a sturdy timber structure with 2 rooms and a loft, built on the foundation her father had started. Xander worked with the focused intensity he brought to everything, and Kessa labored beside him, learning carpentry as they went. Neighbors who had come to accept them offered help, and slowly the house took shape. By summer, the roof was on and the windows installed. They moved in before the interior was fully finished, too eager to wait, and spent their first night in the new house lying on a mattress on the floor, listening to the creak and watching stars through the unfinished loft. "Your father would be proud," Xander said, his arm around her shoulders. "You reclaimed what he built for you." "We reclaimed it," Kessa corrected. "I could not have done this without you. We make a good team." "We do." She turned to face him, her hand on his chest. "I want to plant the orchard this fall. Apple and pear trees on the south slope like my father planned. Then we will plant an orchard." He kissed her forehead. "What else do you want?" "I want to raise our children here, teach them to work this land and be proud of it." She paused. "Is that something you want, children?" Xander's hand found her belly, resting there gently. "I want everything with you. Children, orchard, a life built on honest work and love, all of it. Then that is what we will have." The summer passed in hard work and steady joy. They finished the house, repaired the old fences, planted a kitchen garden that flourished under Kessa's care. In the autumn, they set out 24 young fruit trees on the south slope, their roots wrapped in burlap, their branches bare but promising. Kessa stood among the newly planted trees and thought of her father, of his dreams for this land. He had not lived to see them realized, but she would carry them forward. Every tree that grew, every harvest brought in, every child raised here would be a testament to what he and her mother had built. Xander found her there at sunset, the sky streaked with orange and purple, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am happy," Kessa said simply. "For the first time in 8 years, I am truly happy." "Good." He rested his chin on her shoulder. "You deserve happiness. So do you." She turned in his arms, looking up at his weathered face, his gray eyes soft with love. "Thank you for finding my dowry, for putting every coin in my hands, for giving me a choice when I had none." "Thank you for choosing me," he said, and kissed her as the sun set over their land, over the orchard that would grow, over the future they would build together. Winter came gently that year, the first snow falling light and soft over fields lying fallow for spring. Kessa and Xander spent the quiet months making plans, repairing tools, preparing for the season ahead. And in the deep cold of midwinter, Kessa confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was carrying their first child. They sat by the fire when she told him, his hands cradling hers, his face luminous with joy. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." "Are you ready to be a father?" Kessa asked, nervous despite his obvious happiness. "I am ready to try." He pulled her close, his hand gentle on her still flat belly. "We will figure it out together, same as everything else." The child came with the spring thaw, a healthy baby girl with her father's gray eyes and her mother's green skin. They named her Thora, a strong name for a strong child, and she filled the house with noise and chaos and more love than Kessa had imagined possible. Xander was a devoted father, patient and gentle, staying up through long nights when Thora was fretful, learning to soothe and change and comfort with the same methodical care he brought to farming. Kessa watched him rock their daughter by lamplight and felt her heart swell with gratitude for this good man, this unexpected partner, this love that had grown from ledgers and legal battles into something vast and abiding. 2 years later came another daughter, Zara, dark-haired and fierce even as an infant. The house rang with children's laughter, with the sound of small feet running through rooms, with the ordinary miracles of family. The orchard began to bear fruit in the 5th year, small apples and hard pears that would sweeten with time. Xander and Kessa harvested them together while Thora and Zara played in the grass, and that night they made the first preserves from their own trees, continuing the work Kessa's mother had started so long ago. Life was not without difficulty. There were hard winters and failed crops, sickness that swept through and had to be weathered, neighbors who never quite accepted an orc woman as an equal. But there was also joy in abundance, in the work of building something real, in watching their daughters grow strong and confident, in the steady partnership of two people who had found each other against all odds. On their 10th anniversary, Kessa and Xander stood in the orchard at sunset, the trees now tall enough to provide real shade, their branches heavy with fruit. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "The trouble I brought you, the fights with neighbors, the way people still talk." Xander pulled her close, his arms familiar and safe. "Not for a moment. You brought me everything that matters: love, family, purpose. A reason to be the man I wanted to be." He kissed her, long and sweet. "I would do it all again, Kessa, every bit of it." She believed him, because she knew him now the way you could only know someone after a decade of shared life, knew his honesty and his strength and the quiet fierceness of his devotion. "I love you," she said, the words easy now after years of practice. "Thank you for giving me back my future. Thank you for letting me be part of it." He rested his forehead against hers, and they stood together under the fruit trees her father had dreamed of, on the land she had reclaimed, surrounded by the life they had built from theft and ledgers and one man's choice to do the right thing. The girls came running then, Thora and Zara, laughing and demanding attention, and Kessa and Xander turned to them, to the future spreading before them like the valley below, rich with possibility and hard-won peace. Years passed in the rhythm of seasons, of planting and harvest, of children growing and new challenges met. The farm prospered, the orchard matured, and the family expanded again with the birth of a son they named Zenith, sturdy and laughing, with his mother's tusks showing early. The Roughwaters eventually left the district, selling their farm and moving east after Thomas's health failed. Kessa felt nothing when she heard the news, not anger or satisfaction or even relief. They had become irrelevant, ghosts of a painful past that no longer had power over her present. The town of Millbrook slowly changed too, new families moving in, old prejudices fading as younger generations grew up seeing Kessa as simply a neighbor, a skilled farmer, a woman who had fought for her rights and won. There were still those who sneered at mixed families, but they were fewer now, their voices drowned out by the progress of ordinary kindness. Magistrate Gray visited the farm once, years after the hearing, an old man nearing retirement. He walked the orchard with Kessa and Xander and nodded approvingly at what they had built. "You made the right choice," he told Kessa, "fighting for what was yours. Too many people accept injustice because the fight seems too hard." "I had help," Kessa said, smiling at Xander. "I could not have done it alone." "None of us can," Gray agreed. "But you had the courage to begin, and that matters most." When their eldest, Thora, was 16, the same age Kessa had been when her parents died, Kessa took her daughter to the edge of their land and showed her the boundaries. "This was your grandfather's dream," she said. "Land worked with honest hands, a home built on love and justice. He did not live to see it fully realized, but we carry it forward for him." Thora, tall and strong with her father's steady gray eyes, nodded seriously. "I will remember." "Remember also that it was almost lost," Kessa continued. "Stolen by people who thought I had no right to claim it. Never forget that you must fight for what is yours, that the law exists to protect you, but only if you have the courage to invoke it." "I understand, Mother." Kessa hugged her daughter tight, breathing in the scent of youth and possibility. "Good. Now go help your father with the evening chores." Thora ran off, and Kessa stood alone looking at the orchard, the house, the barn, all the evidence of a life reclaimed and rebuilt. Sometimes she still thought about that night she had walked away from the Roughwater farm with nothing but a blanket full of possessions and a stranger's offer of choice. She thought about Xander standing in the study, his gray eyes steady, telling her that theft could sometimes be undone. She thought about the magistrate's gavel falling, declaring her the rightful owner of her father's land. She thought about the first time Xander had said he loved her, standing in a field of possibility. Every good thing in her life had grown from that choice, that moment of walking toward uncertainty rather than staying in familiar pain. Xander found her there as the sun set, sliding an arm around her waist in the comfortable intimacy of long marriage. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The past, the future, how grateful I am for both." She leaned into him. "How grateful I am for you. The feeling is mutual." He kissed her temple. "Come inside. Zara made stew and Zenith swears he can play a song on the whistle you carved him. Can he? Not remotely, but he is enthusiastic." They walked back to the house together, to the warm light spilling from windows, to the sound of their children laughing, to the ordinary magic of family and home. Kessa paused at the threshold, looking back once more at the orchard silhouetted against the dying light, her father's dream realized. Her mother's legacy honored. Her own life freely chosen and fiercely defended. Every coin of her dowry reclaimed and transformed into this, into abundance and love and a future without limits. She smiled and stepped inside, closing the door on the past and embracing the present, where Xander waited with patient love, and their children filled the house with joy, where the land she had fought for would sustain them for generations, where the story that had begun with theft and ledgers had become something beautiful and lasting. This was home, this was healing, this was justice, hard won and sweetly kept, and it was enough, more than enough, it was everything.